Thermoplastic splints can be made over any part of the body. Today we are going to make a carpal support splint. Splints can be made directly over the animal's limb or over a neoprene wrap. First, we need to make a paper pattern of the splint that we want using a paper towel. The splint should be half the circumference of the limb. Too shallow and the limb will pop out of the splint. Too deep and the limb may get stuck inside the splint. Not a good scenario. Mark the paper towel with a pen roughly the size of the splint that you would like. Make it just a little bit bigger so that you have room to play. Then cut your paper pattern out with a scissors. Check your paper pattern against the limb and make sure it's the right size for your splint. Then trace it using a wax pencil or crayon directly onto your thermoplastic sheet. Fill a hot pan with about 1 inch of water and turn it to just under boiling. I use an electric skillet. It works great and it's inexpensive. Then add your thermoplastic sheet and wait 1 to 3 minutes until it softens. Check it using a solid spatula, not one that is slotted. Once the thermoplastic is soft, remove it from the hot water and dry it completely using a clean cotton towel. Then cut your splint pattern out using a scissors. The splint material should be soft and pliable and easy to cut. If it gets a little too stiff, put it back in the hot water for a few seconds. Then remove it and continue cutting out your shape. Then dry the sheet completely with a towel and use the towel to transfer it over to the pet. Transferring the thermoplastic sheet with the towel will prevent it from stretching. Gently mold the thermoplastic sheet over the neoprene wrap. Depending on the thickness of the thermoplastic, it should take about 1 to 3 minutes to set. In the meantime, use a wax pencil to mark the areas that need to be trimmed. Then continue to mold the thermoplastic splint using wide, gentle finger applications. You don't want to press too hard with your fingers or you will leave indentations. Make sure you gently mold around discrete areas like the accessory carpal pad and the dew claw. As the splint continues to set, use your wax pencil to make any final marks. The corners of the splint should be rounded. If the splint is soft enough, you can continue to cut it with the scissors. Otherwise, use a heat gun. Heat guns are really useful for spot heating and for making alterations as well as smoothing the edges of the splint. I turn the heat gun on the lowest setting and then gently run my splint over the heat gun until the edges soften and are soft enough for me to cut. Remember to round all of your corners as these can act as pressure points on the pet. Trim any excess material off and then do the blind touch test to check for any rough edges. Close your eyes and run your fingers along the edges of the splint. All edges should feel very smooth with no sharp ends. For any sharp edges, run that edge over the heat gun until it's soft, then use your thumb pad to smooth out that edge. Then check the splint fit on the pet. That looks pretty good. Finally, you need to flare away the proximal edge of the splint. To do this, dip the proximal edge into the hot water and use the base of your palm to flare the edge away. At this point, you may need to round your corners again as they've become squared off. The neoprene brace acts not only as padding, but also a great method to hold the splint in place. Just cut a few pieces of self-adhesive hook and place them inside the trough of the splint. Heating the adhesive makes it stickier, so run it over the heat gun, then place the hook inside the trough. It's always a good idea to label your splint for pet parents so that they know which side is up. Even though the splint does a pretty good job of sticking to the neoprene wrap, it's always a good idea to add some outer straps to hold everything in place. Using the same method as before, attach some self-adhesive hook to the outside of the splint. For most splints, it's a good idea to have a proximal strap, a distal strap, and a strap that sits directly over the key joint. In this case, the carpus. Notice how I rounded the corners of the self-adhesive hook pieces. This helps the self-adhesive hook to stay in place and not peel away. Then take nylon strapping material and cut to size. It's always a good idea to use a wider strap over the key joint. Mark the excess strapping material and trim. A few tips about making a splint directly over the animal's limb. You actually don't want to make it directly over the limb. You want a light layer of protection between the splint and the limb. I like the tubey pad because it's stretchy and it has a thin layer of foam padding inside. The splint is made directly over the tubey pad, just like it was over the neoprene wrap. You are going to be removing the tubey pad, so you need to add a light layer of self-adhesive foam inside the splint to protect the leg. Cut a strip of padding that takes up about 1/2 to 3/4 of the inside of the splint. Rounding your corners will help the padding stay in place and not peel away. Peel away one end of the backing and start applying the padding inside the trough. Feed the padding through while slowly pulling away the backing. Then check fit and apply your straps just like we did before. And there you have it, 2 ways to splint over a pet's carpus.